Since I've asked you to pay special attention to Hamlet's soliloquies, I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about them myself. Obviously, there are lots of different approaches we can take to the soliloquies, so here I'll just concentrate on one we've only touched on so far, the insight that these speeches give us into Hamlet's changing attitudes towards death and the afterlife. Faith and doubt are important problems for Hamlet, and the soliloquies help give us an insight into that development. Here's Hamlet's first soliloquy. We're in Act 1, Scene 2. He begins with something like an ironic prayer, wishing that God had not forbidden people from committing suicide. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. His attention turns fairly quickly away from theological matters to very earthly issues. That image of the garden offers a nice transition, doesn't it? We also notice that Hamlet mixes in classical references, such as the sun god Hyperion, or a satyr, which was a half-man, half-beast creature. He also mentions Niobe as an image of his mother, and Hercules. And of course the point here is that he's very different than Hercules. The point is that Hamlet's thinking here about his religious obligations. It's God's judgment that prevents him from committing suicide. But he's not doctrinally Christian thinker, and his confusion about his religious obligations are going to get the better of him. One side note about this speech before we leave it. Notice the way his grammar breaks down when he begins talking about his mother, especially this area here, frailty thy name is woman. He can't even finish a sentence for several lines. What does that suggest to you about what's causing his conflicted state of mind? Here we're in the second soliloquy, the one that ends Act 2. And I'll focus on one specific issue. Hamlet suggests that the ghost he saw may actually be the devil. The spirit that I have seen may be the devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape. Yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. So he's using this idea that the devil is trying to trick him as a justification for delaying his revenge and testing Claudius with the play he's just requested. Ironically, this is the first and only time Hamlet suggests that the news from the ghost may be unreliable, and it's important that he recognizes that the devil may be working on his own, quote, weakness and melancholy, end quote. That tight relationship between the internal self and the spiritual world is going to have increasingly powerful implications. So here's the famous third soliloquy, taken from Act 3, Scene 1. It's worth pointing out that early editions of the play place this soliloquy after Hamlet's argument with Ophelia. That's how it's arranged in Sir Laurence Olivier's film, by the way. The suggestion, of course, is that Hamlet is moved to thoughts of suicide again by his conflicted feelings about Ophelia. In its present place in this scene, Hamlet's melancholy seems less clearly motivated. What I want to flag for you here is the very different explanation we get for Hamlet's decision not to commit suicide. He walks in, of course, thinking about ending his life. To be or not to be, that is the question. And he's got a lot of good reasons for, frankly, wanting to get out. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. He thinks about death as just another form of sleep. And yet, what he starts worrying about is what happens in that sleep of death when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. What he worries about, obviously, are the dreams that may come, the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. In the first soliloquy, you'll recall, he opted not to kill himself simply because God said not to. Here, the reason is much more complicated, but ultimately boils down to the fact that Hamlet doesn't know what comes next. The afterlife may be even scarier than the life he's living now. Finally, in the last major soliloquy, from Act 4, Scene 4, what I'd like you to think about again is the reasoning process Hamlet's using. He begins again with the conventional assumption that human beings are created by God. He says, "What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed, a beast no more? Sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fusten us unused." But he goes on to insist that the creation included reason, and that it's reason that needs to guide his actions. Now, this is very different from the Hamlet we met back in Act 1, someone who was looking for divine guidance and trying to follow divine law. The irony, of course, is that he reaches the conclusion that he has to take bloody action, and then meekly follows Rosencrantz and Guildenstern off to the ship that's supposed to take him to England. Now, this has been a deliberately rough and sketchy tiptoe through four specific moments in the play, and I'm not claiming that the soliloquies are all or even only about death and the afterlife. But hopefully this has given you some new questions to ask, or a new direction to consider, as you think about Hamlet's changes over the course of the play. And here's another little brain teaser. Each of the play's first 4 acts has a major soliloquy in it, but Act 5 does not. There's evidence, by the way, that Shakespeare cut the 4th soliloquy back pretty drastically after the play was first staged, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Can you think of any artistic or thematic reason why soliloquies might be appropriate in the first 4 acts, but not in the last one?